I first encountered Elisabetta Dandolo, a wealthy woman from Venice, Italy, through her last will and testament while working on my doctoral dissertation research in the summer of 1997. In many ways, her final bequest, recorded April 21st, 1348, was typical of those of widows of her station. She divided her considerable resources between her surviving children, other relatives, and servants, while making detailed gifts to a number of religious institutions, including masses and prayers for her soul, communities of nuns, and to benefit the poor of the city. Men and women, rich and poor, recalled their Catholic practices in their wills, indicating both the importance of religion in their lives and their thoughts and fears about the uncertainty of death. I might never have remarked upon the significance of Elisabetta's death had it not been a comment added to the will by her notary, parish priest Donato Ghibellino, who worried in recording the will 2 months later that death may prevent this testament from being formalized. Of course, he meant his own death from the bubonic plague, which had arrived in Venice in late 1347, diminished in its virulence over the winter, and roared back with authority in the spring, taking with it up to 1/2 of the residents of Venice, no doubt including both Elisabetta Dandolo, wealthy widow of the city's ruler or doge, and Donato, an impoverished parish priest. I looked at this will with new and unsteady light when I realized what I held. Had Elisabetta comprehended what killed her? Were her bequests a reflection of her anxiety about an unfamiliar threat to her family, her faith, her city? Did she think, along with many of her contemporaries, that the plague was God's punishment for gluttony, greed, and sin? Although her will had requested burial with her husband, her body was not found there. Was she, along with Donato the priest, and thousands of others, buried in communal graves without any of her funerary wishes, lacking the trappings of death that so mattered to devout Catholics because of the crisis in which she died? And how long after he had touched the very page that I now held, nearly 650 years later, did Donato the priest die? Was I holding a relic of the Black Death? Could the evidence of the disease linger on this piece of parchment for so many years? Venice was one of the plague's first European hotspots, the New York City of the Middle Ages. It was an increasingly wealthy and cosmopolitan city, home of Marco Polo and thousands of merchants like him who traveled and traded on the Silk Road, bringing goods from the Middle East and Asia to emerging European markets, and getting rich in the process. In addition to luxury goods, the Polos were gemstone importers, trade brought grain because the European population was booming and could not feed its rising numbers, in part because of the Little Ice Age, which brought cooler temperatures and a shorter growing period. Europeans were malnourished from food shortages, and impoverished farmers could not grow enough to feed their own families prior to 1347, factors which surely contributed to the virulence of the plague, which most scholars believe began in Asia with fleas and rats. In 1346, the Golden Horde, descendants of the great warrior Genghis Khan, laid siege to the city of Kaffa on the Black Sea, bringing the disease to the Genoese and Venetian merchants there, whose ships carried grain, with infected fleas and rats, to the west in 1347, forming the vector which brought the bubonic plague, and probably a secondary, equally virulent pneumonic plague, all across the Mediterranean, including Constantinople, then controlled by the Byzantine Empire, Sicily, and eventually the Italian mainland, where over the 18 months from fall of 1347 to spring of 1349, up to 60% of the populace died. Although he witnessed the deaths of both his father and his stepmother, and up to 100,000 residents of his hometown of Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio, a banker turned poet, somehow survived. He penned the most famous account of the plague's devastation and impact on people and behavior. The introduction to his compilation of folk tales, the Decameron, describes how people reacted.
There were some people who thought living moderately and avoiding excess might help a great deal in resisting this disease. So they gathered in small groups and lived entirely apart from everyone else. They shut themselves up in houses where there were no sick people, eating the most delicate foods and drinking the finest of wines, always in moderation, of course. Others thought the opposite. They believed that drinking excessively, enjoying life, going about singing and celebrating, satisfying in every way their appetites as best they could, laughing and making light, was the best medicine. They went from one tavern to another all day and night. The laws, both divine and human, had fallen and almost completely disappeared. The ministers and executors of laws were either dead or sick or short of help.
Still others, Boccaccio wrote, left, including the protagonists of his story, a group of wealthy young women who, together with some men they met in church, fled to the Florentine countryside and entertained themselves in isolation through the escapism of storytelling, the Netflix of their day. Their romances, comedic tales, and satires became the stories recorded in Boccaccio's Decameron. As always in history, elite men and women, like Boccaccio's characters, had resources during the plague that were simply unavailable to the less fortunate, as Boccaccio noted when discussing the alarming accumulation of bodies.
The plight of the lower class, and perhaps a large part of the middle class, was even more pathetic. Every day they fell sick by the thousands, and not having servants or attendants of any kind, they almost always died. Many ended their lives in the streets, while others died in their homes and were discovered dead by their neighbors only by the smell of their decomposition. The city was full of corpses. So many corpses would arrive in front of a church every day and at every hour that the amount of holy ground for burials was insufficient. When all the graves were full, huge trenches were dug in cemeteries, and into them new arrivals were dumped by the hundreds, and they were packed in there with dirt, one on top of another, like a ship's cargo, until the trench was filled.
To Boccaccio, to Elisabetta Dandolo and Donato Ghibellini, and to the residents, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, of the medieval Mediterranean, the rituals of dying were essential transitions, and their absence signaled the breakdown of daily life. Agnolo Tura of nearby Siena made a similar description of burials, noting that he had put 5 sons in the ground without benefit of priest or family.
No one controls anything, and they do not even ring the church bells anymore.
Religion, government, and family were the pillars of this world, and even the latter failed, as Boccaccio noted.
One citizen avoided another. No one cared for his neighbor, and relatives rarely visited each other. They stayed far apart. The disaster had struck such fear into the hearts of men and women that brother abandoned brother, uncle abandoned nephew, sister left brother, and very often, wife abandoned husband.
Boccaccio's narrating character, the beautiful Pampinea, encapsulated the despair felt by young and old, male and female, rich and poor.
We live in the city, in my opinion, for no other reason than to bear witness to the number of dead bodies. We see those condemned to exile for their crimes, making sport of the laws, running wildly through the city. Nor do we hear anything but so-and-so is dead, and so-and-so is dying. And if there were anyone left to mourn, we should hear nothing but piteous laments everywhere. When I go home, there is no one there except my maid, and my hair stands on end, and I see the shadows of those have passed away, not with the faces I remember, but with horrible expressions that terrify me.
Confronted with terror and the overturn of their lives, many embraced a popular spirituality that advanced beyond mere prayer to a need to see, hear, smell, and or touch the divine. Muslim Imam Ismail Umar ibn Kathir recounted the following events in Damascus, Syria, in the summer of 1348.
On June 7, the crowd assembled before the mihrab and resumed the recitation of the flood of Noah, of which a reading was made 3,363 times, in accordance with the counsel of a man to whom the prophet had appeared in a dream. On July 21, a proclamation was made in the city, inviting the population to fast for 3 days, then to go on foot to the mosque in order to beseech Allah to take away the plague. One saw in this multitude Jews, Christians, Samaritans, old men, old women, young children, poor men, emirs, nobles, magistrates, not ceasing to chant their prayers until daybreak.
In Sicily, wrote Michele da Piazza,
some went to the city of Catania, believing the Blessed Virgin Agatha of Catania would deliver them from this illness.
For those who could not travel, holy water that had bathed the relics was transported to the city of Messina, where priests sprinkled drops on hundreds of people. Others processed, barefoot and singing, 6 miles to a holy shrine, singing and praying, before touching a statue of the Virgin Mary, hoping for protection from the disease. In a more extreme practice, flagellants processed through many European streets, beating themselves until they bled. These people, like many, wondered whether the disease was, as Boccaccio put it,
God's wrath as a punishment to mortals for our wicked deeds.
Such practices, which seem strange to our ears, are a testament to the broad and deep place God, be he called Yahweh, Allah, or God, and fear of him occupied in the lives of people across the medieval Mediterranean. Responses to the current pandemic suggest we are not as different as we might imagine. A poll by the University of Chicago Divinity School found that 63% of Americans who identify as religious believe the disease is a message from God to mend sinful ways. And lawsuits about opening churches suggest that, like historical ancestors, some Americans currently seek comfort in the familiar rituals of the divine, despite risks to personal health. Imam Ismail Umar recounted a remarkable moment of unity across gender, class, and religious lines as the plague struck Damascus. But unfortunately, much more common during the bubonic plague era was the use of religious belief as justification for segregation and violence. Beginning in spring of 1348, responding to spurious rumors, the fake news of its day, about the spread of the plague through poisoned water wells, Christians attacked Jewish residents in up to 100 cities and towns in southern France, northern Spain, and Germany, resulting in the death of thousands. Jewish leaders in Barcelona wrote to King Pedro IV of Aragon in 1354, asking for, and receiving, protection from Christians who,
on the day when any plague or famine has occurred, make the earth tremble with their cry. All of this is because of the sins of Jacob. Let us destroy this nation. Let us kill them. During this disaster, instead of behaving well and with love and doing good for the poor, they take the foolhardy path of attacking hapless Jews.
Belief in divine intervention and science and human reason uncomfortably coexisted in the medieval Mediterranean, home to great Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scientific thinkers. Unfortunately, neither classical nor contemporary medical practice offered much in terms of best practices for containment or treatment of the bubonic plague. Medical practitioners struggled to confront the plague, given their existing knowledge. Doctor's son, Gentile da Foligno, illustrates the state of medical wisdom of the period when he advised his patients to eat good bread and wine, but not fish, use the practice of bleeding, and the application of an anti-poison potion made from snakeskin. These methods might sound arcane to us, but a quick search of today's internet finds our own fair share of miracle cures from herbs and potions. Gentile's treatment reflects the medieval theory of bodily balance, which taught that illness could be treated by maintaining balance in the amount and temperature of the body's fluids, adding good elements, bread and wine but not fish, thought to be too cold for the humors, and subtracting bad ones, hence bloodletting. Abu Ja'far ibn Khatima, a Muslim physician from Granada, took what to our ears sounds like a more modern interpretation.
It is clear and obvious that it is the nature of the disease to spread and contaminate surroundings. The best thing we learn from extensive experience that if someone comes into contact with a diseased person, he immediately is smitten with the same disease.
Abu Jafar seemed to understand the need for isolation and uncontaminated air, but he also advised
having fresh air by living in houses facing north, filling them with cold fragrances and aroma of flowers, by sprinkling houses with rose water mixed with vinegar, use the same on oneself.
And like Boccaccio, he feared his inability to comprehend, let alone cure the disease, advising his readers to
rely on Allah. He is the best and most compassionate protector.
These narrators paint a dark and largely hopeless scene of lawlessness, breakdown, and fear. Fear of disease, but perhaps even worse, fear that the Almighty had already deserted them. Yet there was hope and survival. Physicians thought of the plague as a poison, their way of understanding the pathology of contagion. Across Italy and Europe, when the plague returned, as it did for every generation until the 18th century, cities were ready, hiring officials to dispose of the deceased, called pizzaga morti, or Caesars of the dead, and paying them a good salary, and establishing or enhancing magistracies to oversee the plague and other civic health issues. They established hospitals specifically dedicated to treating plague victims, charitable institutions perhaps endowed by wealthy survivors of Elisabetta Dandolo in memory of her suffering and death. In other words, they took steps, rudimentary though they were, towards today's public health offices and institutions. And what about Boccaccio? Recently, Stanford historian Paula Findland reflected upon the Decameron's collection of fictionalized folktales and its all-too-real eyewitness description of the plague as introduction in light of COVID-19.
Boccaccio described in hilarious yet bitingly pointed detail how humans repeatedly deceived and failed to understand or care enough for each other, and how readily they traded their ideals for more immediate pleasures and tangible rewards. Human arrogance and greed, knowledge and deceit, lust and love, laughter and passion fill the pages of his collection. Boccaccio's clear-sighted vision of the world as it is, and not as it ought to be, was his ultimate gift to a generation that endured a truly dreadful disease. With his pen, Boccaccio subtly reminded his fellow Florentines, and many generations of readers everywhere who have delighted in his stories, that plague arrived in his city not because the constellations had aligned badly, not because it was God's will, but as the inevitable consequence of a restless and consuming society ever on the move. Whether the values of society would ever change, especially after a moment of such profound disruption, became his enduring question. It has now, once again, become ours.
By juxtaposing often lighthearted literary tales with the grim realities of his day, Boccaccio reminds us of the richness of lives lived, lost, and intertwined by strands of global interconnection, nearly 700 years ago and again today.